Everything you need to know about 1984 Chapter 2. Now, Chapter 2 picks right up where Chapter 1 left off, with Winston getting up to answer the door, fearing that the thought police have arrived to arrest him. This chapter gives us insight into some of the propaganda, the indoctrination, and manipulation techniques that INGSOC, I-N-G-S-O-C, the government of Oceania, uses to control the population. Remember, these are major themes throughout the book, and we will see how the government methods serve to isolate people and keep them living in fear of each other and devoted to the government, or at least terrified of it. When Winston gets to the door, he's relieved to find out it's only Mrs. Parsons, a female neighbor who is married with 2 children. Now, we're told that everyone is supposed to call each other comrade, not Mrs. or Mr. They're trying to do away with those kinds of connections. We find out that she's come to ask him to help repair her clogged sink as her husband was at work. Now, as he enters the apartment, we are given a summary of the horrible disrepair of where Winston lives, a building ironically called Victory Mansions. Basically, the place is falling apart, and it can take up to 2 years to even get a window repaired. So the people living there basically have to scrape together whatever resources they have and make as many repairs as possible themselves. Now, Winston tells us the apartment itself inside is a mess with stuff strewn everywhere, and then it smelled like old sweat. On the walls are posters like Big Brother and youth organizations that the children belong to. He hears from the other room someone trying to play along with the telescreen, the music coming from it, on a comb, which is like a paper and comb where you can kind of hum through it and make it buzz. Mrs. Parsons tries to make an excuse for the mess by saying that the kids hadn't been out of the flat or the apartment yet that day. The sink is filled with disgusting green cabbage water, and Mrs. Parsons continues to give excuses, saying her husband would fix it quickly had he been home. Winston describes Mr. Parsons as a chubby moron who's a blind devotee of the party, aging out of all the government programs they have. So he doesn't want to leave the youth program until he gets kicked out, that kind of thing. And he's on every committee and has every position he can that doesn't require any smarts at all. He likes to brag of his commitments and that he's at the community center every night of the week, which the party likes you to do. Winston asks Mrs. Parsons for a spanner, which is a wrench. As Winston pulls out a nasty clod of hair, the children come running in. Now, the boy is 9 and the girl is about 7. He comes in with a toy gun, yelling for Winston to put his hands up, and the girl has a piece of wood she's using like a gun, imitating her brother. They're both in uniform of a group called the Spies. When Winston puts up his hands, they start jumping around him, yelling, calling him a traitor and a spy and a thought criminal, that they're going to vaporize him and send him to a labor camp. So Winston is kind of filled with this dread, just creeped out, saying he could tell the boy wanted to strike him and hurt him. And it was like kind of being circled by tiger cubs that you knew sometime in the near future would hunt you for real. Mrs. Parsons looked nervous, making the excuse that the kids were bummed because she didn't take them to the public hanging since her husband wasn't home and she had too much to do. At this, the girl and the boy begged to be taken to the hangings. Winston departs, but as he's walking down the hall, he feels this painful blow on the back of his head, and he turns around, and when he does, the boy's putting away a slingshot as his mother drags him into the apartment. He calls Winston Goldstein, which you can remember from Chapter 1, and Winston can see fright and this despair on Mrs. Parsons' face. She's scared of her own kids. Back in his apartment, greeted by the sound of the telescreen, Winston reflects on the state of the children these days, knowing Mrs. Parsons was in for it, that as her children got older, they'd be watching her closely for any disloyalty to the party and report her to the authorities. He tells us that all children are horrible, that the groups of the party make them savage. They use chants and drills, military exercises, hikes, all these things to basically indoctrinate them. So rather than rebelling against the party, they eat it up like it's a game. So parents come to fear their children, and the papers often have stories about child heroes that reported their parents for disloyalty. As the sting from the slingshot wore off, Winston begins thinking of O'Brien and a dream that he had had almost a decade before. So he was walking in this dark room when someone next to him said, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." Now he has no clue to the meaning of that, but over time he's come to believe that O'Brien was the person in the dream, even though it was dark and he couldn't see. Winston's thoughts are interrupted by an announcement from the telescreen about a glorious victory. Winston knows that despite these words, there would be bad news coming. Now, sure enough, after describing a military success, he's told that the chocolate ration would be reduced by 1/3. Now, right after, a national anthem started where people were supposed to stand at attention. Now, Winston doesn't, as he's in the nook and out of view of the telescreen, or else he'd have to. He hears a bomb explode in the distance, adding to and telling us that 20 to 30 a week are falling on the city. So sitting there, Winston despairs and feels alone, knowing that he could never know that even a solitary person was on his side or thinks like he does. He feels trapped on all sides by the party slogans and the always watching eyes of the future, a big brother. A different past or future might just be his imagination, and with the diary that was in front of him, he is only facing death. He knows the diary and everything about him in his life would be wiped out. He goes back to the diary and basically writes a greeting to the people of a different time where thoughts are free and truth exists. He adds that thought crime which he's committing by even thinking about the diary is death. And he realizes now that he knows he's a dead man. And the goal, now that he's a dead man, is to stay alive as long as he can. He sees his 2 fingers have ink on them from the pen and thinks that's the detail that someone would for sure report. So he goes and scrubs his fingers clean with this rough soap that's like sandpaper. Even though he knows it's useless to hide the diary, he still puts it in the drawer and puts a speck of dust on the corner so he'll know if it's been moved. He wants an alert, I guess. So what should we take from this chapter? Now, the mood and tone of this entire chapter, maybe of the entire book, is of despair, hopelessness, and fear. Orwell's not painting us a hopeful or pretty picture. Every detail given contributes to the oppressiveness of life in Winston's world. All around him is decline and disrepair. Living conditions are continually deteriorating, from the rundown buildings to the availability of food and everyday items. Rationing is government-forced limits on food and other items, and from Winston's knowledge that a good report would bring bad news, we know that continual reductions of what people are given are common and occur regularly. They get less and less. Even the quality of the items are poor. The soap is so rough it scratches your skin. Life is a grind. We also see the dark and menacing reality of the culture as well. Kids being taken to public executions, it's disgusting. We see that the government begins its indoctrination and desensitization to violence and trying to control people at a young age through the children who are taught loyalty to the government over the family. Even within their own homes, people live in fear. As the presence of the telescreen and its ability to spy, those weren't enough, children also become tools of the government to watch people's unguarded moments. The idea is to break down human connections and keep everyone isolated and living in fear so that their connection, their one connection, their object of devotion becomes the government or its iconic figure of Big Brother. The only alternative to sole allegiance to the government is what Winston tells us at the end of the chapter, which is certain death. The presence of the government is inescapable, from the giant monoliths of the government buildings dwarfing everything around them, to the presence of Big Brother and the party slogans everywhere, including money, that has Big Brother and the slogans on it, to the telescreens and other methods of spying, like your neighbor, your spouse, your children. Winston is right to despair. Questions, comments, put them in the box down below.